In our last episode, Abdulhamid was crowned Sultan in the shadow of fear. His uncle Abdulaziz was dead, perhaps murdered by his own ministers. His cousin Murad had broken under the weight of the throne, raving in his palace until he was locked away for life. Abdulhamid had taken the crown not with triumph but with dread. He walked to the coronation alone, a revolver at his hip, soldiers drilling with empty rifles. When the sword of Ottoman was placed in his hands, he gripped it not as a relic of glory but as a weapon he might one day need to draw. Sword in hand, gun on side, a ruler born not of dreams but of fear. This is road to destruction, the world wars. Now in the autumn of 1876, the empire turned to its new sultan for hope. The treasury was bankrupt. The Balkan provinces were in open revolt. Russian armies massed beyond the Danube, waiting for their moment, and in Istanbul, European vultures circled, while ministers whispered that only reform could save the state. At their head stood Midhat Pasha, a name already familiar to us. He had been a reformer under Abdulaziz, a governor in the Balkans, and a man celebrated in Europe as the architect of progress. Alongside him were intellectuals like Namık Kemal, the fiery poet of liberty, and the circle of reformers who called themselves the Young Ottomans. To them, Abdulhamid was a blank slate, a quiet, overlooked prince who might be convinced to lead a new era. Their solution was radical, a constitution. For centuries, the Sultan's power had been absolute, checked only by palace intrigue and the mutiny of soldiers. Now, for the first time, a written charter would define the rights of the people and the limits of the throne. The timing was no accident. The empire had defaulted on its debts in 1875, and the creditor powers, Britain, France, Austria, demanded reform in exchange for patience. They wanted the Balkans pacified, minorities protected, and their loans repaid. A constitution, they argued, would show the world that the Ottoman Empire was becoming civilized, a partner worth saving, albeit one under control. And so, in December 1876, under Abdulhamid's watch, the first Ottoman constitution was proclaimed. A parliament was summoned in Istanbul. Deputies arrived from every corner of the empire: Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Kurds. Some came in ornate kaftans, others in the modern fez and frock coat. Their speeches filled the chamber with new words: liberty, equality, representation. Newspapers, briefly freed from censorship, heralded the dawn of a new age. But Abdulhamid was no liberal. He had studied Europe on Abdulaziz's grand tour of 1867. He had seen the parliaments of London and Vienna, the boulevards of Paris, the applause of the crowds. And he had seen the contempt behind their smiles, the whispers about Ottoman debts, the mockery of the sick man of Europe. To Abdulhamid, a parliament was not a symbol of strength. It was a stage for betrayal. So he played his part carefully. He allowed the constitution, smiled for Europe, and sat for portraits as a reformist monarch with his grip firmly on that sword. But in the text of the document, he secured escape clauses: the right to dissolve parliament, the power to exile ministers for state security. It was, from the beginning, a trap. The first months of parliament proved his instincts right. Deputies squabbled over language and privilege. Arab representatives complained of Turkish dominance. Armenians petitioned for reforms in Anatolia. To Abdulhamid, these were not petitions but veiled threats, the same Christian voices Europe always used to weaken the empire from within. Greeks argued over church rights. Every session seemed to confirm what Abdulhamid already believed. Liberty was another word for disunity. To him, the chamber was not a forum of progress, but an echo of his father Abdülmecit's Tanzimat, fine words that had left the empire weak and indebted. And behind it all, Midhat Pasha loomed. To Europe, he was the hero of the moment, the architect of constitutional government. To Abdulhamid, he was a dangerous rival, a man who had already deposed one sultan and might yet depose another. The ministers who had brought down Abdulaziz still haunted the palace. Some were dead, Hussein Avni Pasha shot by Cherkes Hassan, others disgraced or exiled. But Midhat remained, powerful, popular, and ambitious. For Abdulhamid, the lesson was clear. Reform was not salvation. Reform was a weapon in the hands of his enemies. Still, for a brief season, the illusion was dazzling. Crowds in Istanbul cheered the new parliament. European newspapers praised the Sultan as a modernizer. Even in the provinces, there was cautious hope that the empire might find renewal in law. But in Yildiz Palace, Abdulhamid waited, revolver by his side, sword within reach, knowing illusions never last. In early 1878, as war with Russia loomed, he made his move. Parliament was noisy, ineffective, and powerless in the face of invasion. Abdulhamid declared that extraordinary times required extraordinary authority. The constitution was suspended. The parliament was dissolved. Midhat Pasha was summoned to the palace. There he was handed a decree of exile, signed by the very sultan whose throne he had secured. Within days, he was on a ship to Europe, disgraced and powerless. Years later, he would be lured back, tried for treason, and strangled in a prison cell at Taif. For Abdulhamid, it was the perfect ending. The man who had once dreamed of liberty reduced to a corpse in the desert. The Ottoman constitution of 1876 had lasted barely 2 years, but its ghost lingered. For liberals, it was proof that freedom had been strangled in its cradle. For Abdulhamid, it was confirmation that survival required suspicion. His reign would be marked not by liberty, but by fear. Fear of Europe, fear of reform, fear of his own ministers. The empire's brief experiment with liberty was over. Abdulhamid ruled alone, and alone he would face the greatest trial of his reign, war with Russia. Russian armies massed across the Danube, eager to claim the Balkans for orthodoxy. Soon they would cross the frontier, villages would burn, refugees would flood Anatolia, and the empire would be forced to its knees at San Stefano. In our next episode, the Russo-Turkish War, an empire shattered. Heroism at Plevna, massacres in Bulgaria, and treaties that tore the map of Europe apart. From the ruins, Abdulhamid would emerge as the Red Sultan, a ruler who never trusted freedom again. This is Road to Destruction, the World Wars.